This is an 11 Alive Voices for Equality special, Stories of Resilience.
I hope those who are joining us recognize that as we discuss these topics that are important to the API community, it's the type of not only support, but being an ally, which I think is very important. I'm honored and privileged to introduce the panel, and we'll get started with some questions. Joining us first and foremost is Sophia Choi, anchor, reporter, award-winning journalist, Dr. Gulshan Harji, who is the co-founder of Clarkston Community Health Center, Monica Khan, Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We have Phi Nguyen, who is with our Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta. And finally, the Honorable Judge Alvin T. Wong, who is with our DeKalb County State Court. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Let's talk about representation. Is API representation, and we talked a little about that, important in your profession, and why?
Oh, I think it's very important in my field, which is strictly healthcare for the most part. I think it's very important to have AAPI representation. And the reason is because healthcare is unique in that it has to be ethnically, linguistically, and culturally very sensitive. And so at the bedside, it becomes even more important. And for a patient of an ethnic community to be able to speak about, say, their mental health or violence at home, there has to be some connection. And so from that standpoint, I have only a couple of suggestions. One is that we need more AAPI representation in the medical schools, in the healthcare educational facets. I think the other thing is that, and we will, I'm sure, touch this later, is that healthcare is very unique and that it is a right. And unless we have advocacy that focuses on the needs of healthcare of the AAPI population, we may not make much progress. So I think we need legislators that are of AAPI background who can advocate on our behalf. And I'm sure that this may also come back later in that the immigration issues are very, very important, and we need AAPI representation to create some changes for us.
What are some of the resources and sources that anyone in our community can leverage to be aware of what's going on in the API community, to be allies, to be advocates, to be supporters?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for also uplifting the increased wave of anti-Asian violence that we've seen over the last few years. First, I actually think it's important for people to know that there are multiple forms of violence against APIs, not just the highly visible deaths and physical attacks that we hear about on the street or read about in the news. Anti-Asian violence also includes violence that's not visible, or that maybe is not interpersonal, or that may not even solely be rooted in hate. Anti-Asian violence also includes systemic violence, structural violence, and state violence, including things like incarceration and deportation. And along those lines, I will never forget that the day before the Atlanta spa shootings last March, we were in the process of grieving the deportation of 33 Vietnamese refugees back to the country that they fled many years ago, before we quickly had to pivot to respond to another type of devastating violence that was afflicting our community. In terms of resources, there's no shortage of organizations and advocates who are good resources for understanding how violence affects API communities.
I'm so glad that Phi also mentioned it, because it's a population that we don't openly discuss and gets lost in the narrative. And so, as you mentioned, the data points and the increase in AAPI hate, I just also want to say that we have a history in the United States of AAPI hate that goes back centuries. And while, starting from when the Chinese migrant workers came came to help with the railroad, construction, 3 centuries ago. And so since then, whether it's been, Muslim hate, whether it's been after 9/11, whether it's been, Southeast Asian hate or Asian hate, there has always, been that history in the United States for that. And so while now, because of the pandemic and because, we're now hearing about it in the news, there is an increase in focus and there are more reportings with it. So the data is showing that. But as you mentioned before, there are so many cases that are unreported. So in terms of resources, I have to say I've been doing this work for 25 years. And I'm really grateful to see organizations that Fee has mentioned and others. We all hear about Stop AAPI Hate, which always talks about the latest data points. If you want to know, what is happening, we see it in mainstream news a lot more than we used to.
How do you encourage others to be positive and, just kind of endure in the face of that type of anti-Asian hate and sentiment?
The type of sort of anti-Asian discrimination, I guess, that I have faced in my life tends to be actually mostly from, well, it's either strangers on the street or it's friends and colleagues who make jokes about names or other things. And I used to work in a predominantly white profession. I was a medical malpractice defense attorney. And so I was oftentimes the only Asian American and the only Asian American woman in a lot of the spaces I occupy. I was in Judge Wong's courtroom a few times, and I was very happy to be in a courtroom with an Asian judge. But let me just tell you, that was a very rare experience. But yeah, so there's a lot of learning to just laugh off things that are microaggressions, because these are people who don't intend harm, but obviously it does harm you. You just internalize it and it can grow and fester. And then, the other ways that I've experienced it, I think, a long time ago and even more recently, is just weird comments on the streets, street harassment. It happened pretty recently when I was walking back from voting, actually close to my house, and somebody was like, "Hey, me love you long time," or something like that. And I was like, really? This was last year. I had not heard that since I was a child, in terms of being in spaces where there are other advocates and people who are fighting not just against discrimination and racism towards Asian Americans, but against all communities of color. That gives me hope. And it also gives me hope and optimism to see what Black communities, Latinx community, Asian American communities, and all these other communities who are impacted by racism are able to build, and the joy that we're still able to have, and the cultural practices that we still enjoy, like gathering around food, as everybody mentioned in the beginning.
With the second generation, our voices get louder, because I'll tell you one thing that really bothers me. We get cut out of a lot of opportunities. There are so many programs out there that help minorities, but we're always cut out. It's for Blacks, it's for Hispanics. They never mention Asians. And I wonder why. We're a community just like any other community. There are people who are very wealthy and there are people who really need help. Why are those people who are really needing help not getting the same opportunities as other minorities?
Thank you all for your courage and vulnerability and sharing so many of those painful experiences.
Alive's Chesley McNeil.
Crash, my man.
Starting his forecast.
Morning.
Before you get up. Helping you start the day prepared. Accurate. Worthy of your trust. Part of the 11 Alive Storm Trackers. Making sure you and your family are safe when conditions become severe.
5 minutes out, Chesley.
Chesley, you're next. 3, 2, 1.
Well, here's your forecast for today, folks. We're looking at some heavy rain.
Weekdays on 11 Alive Morning News.
one question, and this is open to everyone on the panels. Since the pandemic, social unrest and extremist polarizing political views have ripped at our country. Do you feel the need to show up differently in the workplace or in the community? And if so, how?
I have been, self-reflecting these past few weeks on how I'm showing up differently. And for me, I think I'm bringing my voice to the table louder and stronger. And we have, you've heard it throughout this panel that we have this stereotype that Asians are quiet, that we're the model minority, that we are more silent, and we will not speak up because we don't want to create waves. I challenge that, and I speak up louder and stronger now because I know that I must for our community. I know I must be, for women who are AAPI. So that is something that I am doing. Whereas before I may have stepped back, I'm actually sitting at the table now and making sure my voice is heard.
Getting a seat at the table, we've had to elbow our way to that table, kicking and screaming sometimes, but we're there now. I think I was stunned when the Asian spa shootings happened because this was coming after the summer protests, right? Our management team learned a lot during those summer protests. They started listening to our Black colleagues and really paying attention to their needs. And so when this happened and they didn't come to the very few Asians in the newsroom and get our take on how we should cover it, it stunned me.
Racism is not only individual that we talked about all of our personal experiences. It is also institutional. The corporations, you remember about maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe even 10 years ago, Abercrombie and Fitch comes out with a T-shirt with an Asian with a wash hat, with a bucket, and said "washi washi." It just very. I don't think they mean any harm by it, but they certainly didn't think it through. And then you have all of these just sort of culturally insensitive things that goes on. Now, I say the showing up, for example, what we are doing today. Say 5 years ago, we would never have this panel. I think all of us that have succeeded in some ways in our chosen profession needs to ask questions more. What do you plan to do to increase diversity participation for African Americans, for Hispanics, for Asians, for all the minority groups? But proof of the pudding to me is put that person in the seat. Let me see more managing partners. Let me see more division leaders. Let me see more judges. So I think for those of us who are in a position to ask questions, we should, and we shouldn't be apologetic.
That is very strong. Sophia mentioned it. We're at the table now. Let's continue to keep a seat at the table and bring others along.
I really think that part of my weather philosophy is just being real with the viewer. You would be surprised how many people contact me saying, hey, I heard somebody else say this and they really scared me. Our weather team just tells it like it is. It's not my job to scare you. It's my job to prepare you. But I will tell you, if it gets serious, I'm gonna let you know. And you'll tell that my demeanor will change. I'll let you know that this is something that you need to take action on right now to keep your family safe.
How can we get involved to address them? I know that Fee touched on microaggressions, just kind of misunderstanding. What are some other issues that exist that you'd like to speak to today?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think the first thing I want to start off with is really, recognizing that the AAPI community is one of the most diverse, largest, communities in the world. We take up maybe, 3 2/3 of the world, with all our different countries and all the different languages we speak, all our cultures. And so using a, one-sided approach is not going to meet the needs of all the communities. There's also the Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, which are also included, in the AAPI diaspora. And so really understanding what their, history has been as well, with militarization, with, which is still happening as we speak, colonization, imperialism. That's something that we've all, all countries probably have, been through when you're talking about the AAPI diaspora. Also within that diaspora, we also have, a few challenges within certain communities as well. And so I really want to hit upon there's, the best way to really understand the community is to listen and get away from the one size, fits all approach when working with community members. With the AAPI community, having the mindset of really learning and understanding, the population is so important, but that it's going to take time, and the representation that we're seeing and the different ways we're working towards it will bring us closer together and hopefully bring some understanding and unity amongst all of us.
The 11 Alive Storm Trackers. It's how you see weather happening now across Metro Atlanta.
These severe storms are now closing in.
We could be talking about damaging winds, hail, and
how you can plan ahead by knowing what's coming overhead.
Heavy storms are rolling in.
Expect pop-up thunderstorms and rain all day long.
And how you'll be weather ready wherever you are.
We expect at any moment a tornado warning can be issued.
The 11 Alive Storm Trackers. It's how you'll be prepared and stay safe.
How can we find those common grounds and find, allyship and support of each other?
And that we uplift the issue that we're really fighting racism, not just against Asian Americans, but against all communities of color who are impacted by structural and systemic racism and inequity. And so I think a few ways that people can be allies and be involved is one, learn about API specific issues, but also learn about the ways that our different histories and struggles are interconnected, and start to make those connections between not just the movement for racial equity for Asian Americans, but also the Black Lives Matter movement, or movements for women's rights, immigrant rights. They're all connected. Everybody has something to contribute. And so if you can identify the thing that you have that will be most beneficial, then contribute that. Some people have the money, some people have the time, some people might have other resources, and there are no shortage of different organizations that you can contribute to.
I think it's also important to not use slang and not tease other Asian AAPI communities. And I think to be respectful, because AAPI communities also come from 50 different countries. They speak 100 different languages. Each is unique in their historical perspective, in the way they dress, in the way they talk, the foods they eat, whether they eat with their hands or they use silverware. I think amongst ourselves, we must be respectful of that. And particularly, I teach my grandchildren, and I continue to remind my children of that too, is the mutual respect is very important. And until we have that, this teasing and all this violence and is going to continue. I think that is one place to stop, is right within the walls of your own home.
I think the best thing that anybody can do, whether it's us or a non-minority, is to be a mentor. If you see somebody that's capable, that has the drive, that has the desire and should be there, and you're in a position to mentor him, mentor her. Pay it forward. Put them in a place where they can succeed.
Thank you all so much for participating, not only sharing your experience, but I love that we are closing out on some really amazing things, right? Pay it forward, right? You're at the table, keep that seat, speak up.